Well, good evening. The 2019-2020 City Center Conversation season has begun, and we're so glad that you have chosen to be a part of it this evening. My name is Gary Arnold, the president of Little Rock Christian Academy, and I must tell you that I'm so excited that Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, is our lead-off thought leader for this series. I count it a personal yay God, and here's why. Months ago, a dear close friend gave me this book, this beautiful book with 12 holes on the cover, saying, Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. And so I read the book, and I fell in love with the book, and ordered 13 more for our Biblical Worldview team out at Little Rock Christian Academy. And it was weeks later that I learned then that Dr. McLaughlin would be the kickoff to this series. And I love it when a plan that isn't a plan turns out to be a great plan, don't you? This evening to me is like we've lit a candle on the cake, and I can't wait to eat the cake. The mission statement of Little Rock Christian Academy begins with these words. We exist to serve families, churches, and the communities. So it's like events like this that help us flesh out our mission statement. And we hope that this evening you'll feel very well served. May I say one more thing? Many people feel a tension, an inappropriate tension between faith and intellect. They feel that if we lift up faith, it's at the expense of the intellect. And if we lift up the intellect, it's at the expense of faith. But you and I'm confident, believe that faith and intellect are joined at the hip. They're inseparable twins. And we believe that they should have the freedom to grow together and help each other become stronger. So I think, in fact, I know that we'll find that true for this evening. And now may I bring up to the stage the visionary behind the City Center Conversations, Dr. Stephen Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Arnold. I'm so glad that you're here tonight. What a great crowd. I see a lot of new faces. Every time we do one of these, see people that I don't know, never seen before. And so what a great group. Thank you for taking time to be out here tonight. We've never done this before in our City Center Conversations. I have a sponsor. And so what Dr. Arnold didn't tell you, that they're sponsoring tonight to a significant degree. So grateful for their partnership because their vision for worldview and culture fits very nicely with the vision of tonight and what we're trying to accomplish in City Center Conversations. So glad that you're here, and stay all the way to the end because I want to make an announcement toward the end about some future events that we're having that you're excited to hear about. Well, our guest, just to get on with, is Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, holds a PhD in Renaissance literature from Cambridge University, and so honored that she's here tonight, and 9 years with the Veritas Forum. And what I'm so excited to announce is she married an Oklahoman. Can you believe that? It's true. So let's welcome Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin. Come on up. So glad you're here tonight. Thank you. Would you sit right there? Thanks for being here. So I didn't make that up, right? You really married an Oklahoma.
Yeah, do you want to know why?
I do, please.
It's really hard to find a good Christian man in England.
Really?
So sometimes you've got to import.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for not discriminating against Americans.
I tried.
You tried?
I did. But after a while, I realized it was only American guys who were asking me out.
Really?
So, yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. So, but
true story.
Is that true story?
Yeah.
But what you said, we shouldn't talk about this, but I'll talk about it. What you said earlier, though, is you felt like American guys were less intimidated by someone who was pursuing a PhD in Renaissance literature. Is that true?
When I was considering going to seminary, I talked to the pastor of my church, who I absolutely loved, and he loved me. We were great friends. And he said to me, with sort of 6'2", booming voice, he said, Rebecca, you do realize if you go to seminary, you're not going to get married. And I said, well, Mark, I don't know what you want me to do about that. And he said, you're already very intimidating to men. This is only going to make it worse. But yeah, American men are okay.
You didn't worry about that?
No.
Okay. I think it's the American football that makes us tougher. I think is what it is. That's just my guess.
My husband was a basketball player.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Okay. So 3 children, is that right?
I hope so.
You hope so? Okay.
When I left this morning, there were 3 of them.
Okay, that's good. And I didn't read this on your bio, but remind me, where in Arkansas are you from?
Where in Arkansas?
Yeah, just teasing. So, but
I'm from I currently live in New Cambridge.
New Cambridge.
Yes.
Okay, so Boston.
Boston.
Area. Okay.
Most people call it Cambridge, but it should be New Cambridge, right? It's New England, so it should be New Cambridge.
Okay, sure, makes sense to me. But where did you grow up? Where's home for you then?
I grew up in London.
In London, okay.
Yes.
Okay, and how did you get to the States then?
Well, do you remember how I married a guy from Oklahoma?
Yes, okay.
Listen to this, I married the only American who does not want to live in England. It's really sad.
Yeah.
He lived there for 5 years. I know so many Americans who tell me they would like to live in England,
yeah.
and I married the guy who didn't. So he dragged me across the pond.
So here you are. Yeah. But this resulted in 2 weddings, you said, like one in the UK and one in Oklahoma, right?
Yes.
Okay.
We thought, who needs compromise?
Yeah.
We're just going to get married in England, the English way, and then we'll get married again in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma way.
Okay.
I wore my dress twice. The pastor who was always going to marry him married us.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
So everybody's happy.
Everybody's happy.
Okay, good. Good. Well, let's jump into it. Again, thank you for being here tonight. Extremely grateful. She got in about 2 hours ago, leaving early in the morning because you do have 3 children and need to be back again.
As far as I know, yes.
As far as you know. So very grateful that you're here. So tell me, let's start with this question, and then I want to jump into it. What motivated you to write Confronting Christianity?
There are so many answers to that question, but I'll give you one. I spent 9 years working at the Veritas Forum, which, if you've not heard of it, is a ministry that, among other things, hosts events in universities with Christian professors talking about their faith, often in dialogue with atheists, agnostics, professors of other belief systems. And during that time, I got to know some incredibly smart men and women who were at the absolute top of their fields in all sorts of academic disciplines, many of which were the exact disciplines that often people out in the world think have disproved or discredited the Christian faith. And they were very serious Christians. Some of them had actually come to faith while they were already professors. And I began to notice there was this big information gap because there were students in the university over here who would go into a psychology of religion class, for example. And they would hear that because there's recent research has shown that there could be reasons in our deep biological past for propensity to believe in God, therefore belief in an actual God was, just part of our biology and that didn't discredited the idea of there being an actual God. But I was like, the guy who invented that whole field is a Christian. So that doesn't make sense. And this was playing out in all sorts of different dimensions. And I was thinking, I feel like I have this treasure map to some of the top Christian thinkers in the world and how they relate their faith to their work, but worship God through their work and find the world more compelling because they're a Christian. And yet there are so many millions of people who think that you kind of have to choose between being a Christian and being somebody who's engaged with ideas. And that made me really sad. So I thought I'm going to try and write a book that answers or addresses some of the big questions that my non-Christian friends legitimately have about Christianity and try and expose them to the stories and arguments of some of the great people I've got to meet.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful. As Dr. Arnold said, this technically falls in the field of apologetics, but to different apologetics, because my neighbors and friends that are unbelievers aren't asking questions about the resurrection. They're asking these kind of questions here. And so it's a kind of thing that's accessible for people who don't have PhDs from the UK, people like me. And so anyways, people very, very accessible. So, but back to what you said about Veritas, it seems like, and this will jump us into the book, many people haven't rejected Christianity. They've rejected a version of Christianity that may not necessarily be true. Would you agree with that? Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many people have read the Harry Potter series. I love that series. So there's a moment in Harry Potter where, I'm going to completely spoil it for you. So block your ears if you've not read Harry Potter, just bear with me. There's a moment where Snape, Harry's teacher nemesis, kills Albus Dumbledore, who's the Gandalf of the series, the only guy whose power for good can match Lord Voldemort's evil. And at the time we think, oh my goodness, this is final confirmation that Snape is on the side of evil. And then at the end of the series, we find that we've got it completely wrong. Harry dives into Snape's memories, because you can do that in Crazy Magic World, and he discovers that everything Snape's done has been motivated by his love for Harry's mother. And we realized that actually Dumbledore had asked Snape to kill him. And so when he asks Snape to, like he says, Severus, please, in this scene, he's actually saying, please kill me, not please don't. And our perception of that whole scene flips around. And I think so often with the questions that my friends have about Christianity, it's kind of like that. At a bit of a distance, they look like Snape killing Dumbledore. But when you look more closely and you get into the big picture of the story of what the Bible's saying and how history is unfolding, you realize that very reason that somebody has for discrediting or not even bothering to look into Christianity turns out to be a reason to consider Christianity.
So if there's the context, the proper context, the truth context behind it, you could easily get to Christianity. It's the perceptions they have to get through that may or may not necessarily be true, and that's what you're trying to dismantle in the book.
Right, you've got to plunge right in.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Well, let's take a really controversial issue. The title of one of your chapters, Hasn't the Bible Disproven Science? A lot of fascinating things in that chapter for those that have read it. Here's one that's fascinating to me. You show where science has been used, and I knew a hint of this, but understood it more after reading the chapter, has been used to actually bring credibility to racism. And so that's not the common narrative. The common narrative is, if there were no religion, we would love each other more. This is John Lennon's vision. What if there were no religions, no heaven, no hell? We would have perfect unity. But in reality, it's that a departure from religion has been used to promote racism. So historically, unpack that for us.
Yeah, so I want to say with science is that science is an incredibly powerful and useful tool. And every single person in this room uses that tool every day. And we should be really thankful for the good things that science has brought to us, like vaccines and iPhones. Vaccines are probably better than iPhones, but yeah. And there are so many people alive today who would not be alive if we didn't have the advances of modern science. We wouldn't be driving cars, for better or for worse. I wouldn't have flown here on an airplane. So many things we have to be thankful for from science. And so many ways we can actually delight, if we are people who believe in God, that we can delight in his creation more by understanding more through science. But science can't give us moral rules or directions. It can help us to design a bomb, but it cannot tell us whether or not to use it. And so science has been used for good in the world, and it's also been used for evil. And one of the things that I think is happening at the moment as our atheist intellectuals today tend to believe strongly in universal human rights and in the idea that we can all be reducible simply down to our biological parts. And those two beliefs don't hang together. And actually, if you start just measuring humans according to their scientific characteristics, you don't have any basis for saying that I am equally valuable to you or to this gentleman here or to that lady there. Suddenly there's no basis for human value at all, and certainly not for saying that humans should be equally valued. And as you say, there have been times where that has been used as a mandate for justifying racial prejudice, and essentially science is one of those things that can be easily co-opted by people of different worldviews and used to kind of justify what they want to do.
Yeah, and you hint at this, but of course this is what happened to the Nazi regime, right? Mm-hmm. The eugenics, the horrible practices that they did on the victims of the Holocaust were driven by this exact mentality, the atheism reduced to its logical conclusion. Of course, historically, there's the idea that because they hijacked part of the church or part of the church attached themselves to the Nazis against Barth and against Bonhoeffer and these type of people, that they get that stigma. But in reality, it was a logical reduction of an atheistic worldview that brought them to do these horrible atrocities and crimes against humanity. So really remarkable. I think it seems one of the reasons that people gravitate towards science is because they might read the first 3 chapters of Genesis, for example, and say, well, there's so many questions left unanswered. And so I like science because it answers questions I'm really asking and doesn't leave these things open. But you make this great statement. This is in the chapter, Hasn't Science Disproved Christianity, page 120. You say this: the lack of scientific detail is not an oversight. By the way, does it freak you out when I read your own words? Are you thinking, did I really write this, or do I remember writing this?
Not so far.
Not so far. Okay, good. So this, making sure. The lack of scientific detail is not an oversight. Rather, speaking of the lack of scientific detail, it is a deliberate prioritization of a more important message.
Yeah. I think science is really important. I don't think it's the most important thing. So like I said, I think I have 3 children. And when I tuck my kids in bed at night, I could say to them, I am a mammal, I am your progenitor, your other progenitor is currently putting the baby to bed, and your DNA is a beautiful combination of the 2 of us. Or I could say, I'm your mother and I love you. Now, my kids need to learn the science of how they are related to me, and that's great and exciting for them. But it's actually more important for them right now that they know that I'm their mother and I love them.
Yeah.
And I think, there are so many interesting questions and interesting debates to be had about how we relate Genesis 1 to 3 to various scientific accounts. But I think we must never lose sight of the fact that actually Genesis is answering some more important questions to us than scientifically how did things come about.
Yeah.
Because, again, God is the greatest scientist in all of history and beyond. But science is not as important as some of these more fundamental questions about, what does it mean to be a human? How do we relate to each other? And how do we relate to God?
Yeah. Yeah, so you see, the Bible's feast of foundational answers to our deepest questions: who are we, what does life mean, and how do we relate to God and to each other? So this reminds me, and some apologists will say this, that the issue with following Christ for some people, and these events, normally we have people all the way, on their faith journey from away from Christ to close to Christ or whatever. But let me say, it's not so much a matter of the intellect, it's a matter of the will. In other words, it's a previous choice of a will not to follow Christ or not to be open to faith. And so as a result of that, I'm going to find things inside the faith I don't like to justify the way I've already chosen to live. So in your traveling about and doing in a form of apologetics, have you found that to be true? People may be predisposed not to follow God, and so they're going to find excuses not to do so anyway? Or do you find more of an openness as you're talking to people?
I think there's a basic fact about human beings that we have a really hard time changing our minds.
Yeah.
Particularly about things that we deeply believe. And particularly about things we deeply believe that we believe in community. And that can be true in a Christian community, and it can also be true in a secular community. That we tend to, we think that we're very independent thinkers, and actually a lot of the time we're not. So I think it's very much true what you're saying, that we can have more emotionally and sort of motives for our beliefs that aren't necessarily purely rational. I think that's absolutely the case. And I think that's true of all of us in different ways. But I think I would want to say that, and I think of this often as I bring up my kids, Christians should be the most intellectually curious people in town. Like, we shouldn't be, if we're Christians, we shouldn't be shying away from questions and really hard issues. We should be leaning into them. And if you're not a Christian here tonight and you've experienced Christian churches as places where no questions are really allowed, and if you just have faith and don't ask questions, I don't think that's what the Christian faith offers us. I think the Christian faith is the greatest intellectual movement in all of history. And I think the intellectual curiosity of Christians has led to many of the greatest academic breakthroughs, including actually the origins of modern science.
Wow.
Which, do you mind if I riff on that for a second?
Please.
So there's an amazing guy called Hans Halvorsen. He's a very mild-mannered philosopher of science at Princeton. And he is probably one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world. And he argues that not only is it the case that historically the first scientists invented the modern scientific method because they believed in God, but that even today, science is better grounded by theism than atheism. The atheists don't actually have any philosophical reason for doing science at all. And the way that he reflects on the origins of science and the scientific revolution is really interesting to me, because he says, we often think that scientific explanations are somehow an alternative hypothesis to God. But actually the first scientists started doing science because they believed that God was rational. And so if there's a creator God who made the world and is the kind of God who gives consistent laws and has a consistent character, as we see in the scriptures, then maybe he created the world according to these consistent laws that we as rational creatures made in his image could discern. But they also believe that God is free. And so God could make the universe any way he liked. And the only way to find out how God in fact made the universe was to go and look. Like, this is the philosophical foundation for the empirical method, like how we do science today. So science is not something that's like owned by atheism. It's actually something owned by Christianity originally. And even today, one of the top philosophers of science in the world says Christianity grounds it better than atheism does.
Wow. Unbelievable.
But true.
But true, yeah, yes. Yeah, that's true. Believable, I should say. Yeah, yes, exactly. Well, I think it's true on a micro level too, because there's a part of Christians who feel like when I'm around my unbelieving friends, I really hope they don't ask me a question I can't answer. But the other side of it is we should really be thinking, I hope they do. Because what's there to lose? It strengthens my faith because now I've got to figure out an answer.
Yeah.
If I'm interested in them and still want to sustain that relationship. And if there is a question, the Bible is not afraid of it, so I shouldn't be either.
Yeah.
And engage it. Yeah. Well, let's shift gears to talk about suffering. It seems like science gets a lot of the headlines and the attention, but the truth of the matter is that probably at people's core, and I think even people that are believers, one of the greatest reservations they have about the faith, or what they can explain about their own faith, or unbelievers' reservations about the faith, is really this idea of evil. And the new atheism and Dawkins and Hitchens, and you quote them here in your book, use that almost as the number one thing to disprove Christianity. So let me read from, again, this is chapter 11, quoting Dawkins, you say, "Our universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference."
Yeah.
And so the greatest apologetic, the greatest evidence that there is no God is all the tremendous suffering in the world. So,
well, interestingly, so Dawkins does say what you just said there, i.e. one of the greatest reasons to not believe in God is all the suffering in the world. However, that specific quote, where he's looking at the universe and saying the universe as we see it now through the lens of science has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, actually exposes the fundamental weakness in the worldview that he is offering to us. Because he is acknowledging there that if you strip away every other meaning than what science can measure, there is no such thing as good and evil. There is no such thing as purpose. There is just indifference. And in fact, if you listen to Dawkins and Sam Harris and many of the new atheist intellectuals, you will find they do not believe in human beings any more than they believe in God. So Sam Harris wrote a book a few years ago called Free Will in 2012. And he said in that book, the idea that we as conscious beings are deeply responsible for our mental lives and subsequent behaviors is simply impossible to map onto reality. Right? There are all these ways in which actually an atheistic worldview that is simply depending on science is eroding the very essence of what it means to be a human being, let alone the basis for us saying that human beings are equally valuable, or that there is any kind of moral problem with me shooting anybody in this room. So atheists may look at Christianity and say, you believe in a loving God, how can you believe that when there's so much suffering in the world? I think the first thing we need to notice is that actually within their worldview, suffering doesn't matter. Like, what are we? We're atoms and molecules. What is good and evil anyway? All of these categories just disintegrate. But I think the second thing we need to say is that when we look at the scriptures, our idea that if God loves us, he could not intend for us to suffer crumbles on every single page. And that's hard for us because I think we have this natural expectation that God wants me to be happy now. Like that must be God's plan for my life. And if it isn't his plan for my life, if it isn't his plan for most people's lives, how can I believe in a God of love? But when we look at the Bible, we find that the person in human history whom God has loved the most is the person who suffered the most. So that's our first kind of puzzle with Christianity. We find suffering, we find that the excruciating death of an innocent man literally staked to the heart of the Christian faith. So the idea that Christianity is just for like shiny, happy people is utterly at odds with what the Bible tells us. And you'll find that as you read the scriptures that the Bible is written by and for suffering people. There's hardly a page of the scriptures, I mean, maybe the Song of Songs, there's hardly a page of the scriptures otherwise that is not by and for suffering people. I'm going to keep, can I keep?
Please.
I'm sort of on the little bandwagon here. the place that I find most helpful in the scriptures to go and examine this is actually in John chapter 11, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus. And there are so many different kind of philosophical approaches you could take to how do we reconcile the idea of a loving God with all the suffering in the world. But I think John 11 has everything that we need, and here's why. So the headline news, if you open your Bible, it'll probably have a title like, Jesus raises Lazarus. And that's kind of the punchline, but I don't think that's what this story is really about. And I'm going to give you a little encapsulation of the story in case you're less familiar with it. So first off, Mary and Martha, good friends of Jesus, their brother Lazarus is sick. They think he's going to die. But great news, they know the best healer in town. And so they dial 911 for Jesus, yeah? And the text says this, because Jesus loved Mary and Martha and their brother, he did not come. You're like, excuse me? Because he loved them, he didn't come? That's what it says. Jesus deliberately waits until Lazarus is dead, and he's been dead for several days before he shows up. And then Martha comes out to him and she says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Mm-hmm. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will do for you. You see that sort of tension. You can hear the reproach in her voice. If you had come when I called you, my brother wouldn't be dead. But we hear her faith as well. I know that even now, whatever you ask of God, he will do for you. And so then we're thinking, okay, come on, Jesus, he's going to raise Lazarus. It's going to happen now. That's what the title of the section said. No. Jesus says your brother will rise again. And you can feel her disappointment. She says, yes, Lord, I know he'll rise again at the resurrection on the last day. She's got the theological answer. Yes, one day God will come and make everything right. But what about now? What about my suffering now, Jesus? And let's remember, Jesus loved Mary and Martha and their brother. And Jesus looks into the eyes of this suffering woman. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he lives, will die. Who dies will live. And anyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus created this situation so that he could have that conversation with Martha. She thinks her problem is that Lazarus is dead. He says, no, the thing you most need from me is not me raising your brother. It is me right now. I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? So we see that within Christianity, God actually meets us in our suffering in a profound way. And that Jesus is available to us in our suffering. And that actually the entire point of our lives, including the joy and including the pain, is to point us to Jesus. But then as the story progresses, we see more. We see Mary comes out, asks the same question, Lord, if you'd been with him, my brother would not have died. And Jesus goes with these sisters to Lazarus' tomb, and then he does a very strange thing. He cries. Well, wait a minute. Why is he crying? There are some people in the crowd who say, look how much he loved this guy who's dead. And other people say, wait a minute. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also stopped this man from dying? So Jesus, who intentionally let Lazarus die, and he knows that he's going to raise him, cries with his sisters. We can know in our suffering that our suffering matters because it matters enough to bring tears to the eyes of the Son of God. And then Jesus raises Lazarus. It's open the tomb. They say, no, don't you realize his body is already decaying, it's going to smell. Jesus says, open the tomb. And he says, Lazarus, come out. And it says, the man who was dead came out. So if you're a Christian, you know the only man in the universe who is able to call somebody out of their grave and to give us hope beyond death. So to me, the idea that suffering is a defeater for Christianity, or that we should abandon Christianity because of the suffering in the world, makes absolutely no sense. I mean, again, I fully understand why people question how can there be a God in charge with all the suffering that we see. But the kind of God that we see in charge in the Bible is the kind of God revealed to us in Jesus Christ.
Right. Yeah, that question assumes that God has his objective as human flourishing defined as a pain-free existence.
Right.
And so if that's the case and God can alleviate that, then he either is incompetent, impotent, or doesn't care whatsoever. But you could only get that way. Yeah, thank you for that. So back to, when before you talked about Lazarus, you talked about how the atheistic worldview ultimately leads to kind of a nihilism, to a nothingness.
Yeah.
But in your conversations with people who are credentialed and bright and academic, do you ever just want to just give them a full shake on the shoulders or just say, can't you see it? Do you feel like it's a intellectual recalcitrance, I'm just not going to believe, or a genuine, I don't get it? It seems like it would make sense, the logical emptiness and void there would be in atheism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I want to shake people or hug them, probably more the latter. I'm kind of a hugger. I don't know, I mean, we're all innately foolish, is the reality of it. Yeah. And we have a really hard time acknowledging that we're wrong. I think, in my experience, quite often when people come to faith in Jesus later in life, if they didn't grow up in a Christian family, it is through an experience of suffering. And so I always find that interesting. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I mean, some of my best friends, including my closest friend who I dedicated this book to, is not a Christian, and she just doesn't see it. She sees how, with the starting points that I have, how everything else holds together. And in many ways, she experiences the loss and the emptiness that comes with not believing in God. But she doesn't have the motivation to hop over, and I think that's, a reality a lot of people live with. I mean, sometimes people say, I wish I had your faith.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you do. You just put it in different things.
Yeah. But you're on this journey with them. Your relationship transcends that, and so you sustain the relationship no matter where they are. A lot to talk about there, but let me shift gears once again because we have 12 questions to cover tonight, so I'm not going to cover them all. So, but just hitting on another one. This struck me right out of chapter 1, back to page 45. You make the shocking statement that Christianity is, quote, the most ethnically diverse faith of all time. Mm-hmm. Now, explain that a little bit. People, the common narrative is this is all Eurocentric, and look at the colonialization of the world, and look at the Spanish Inquisition. The only reason Christianity flourishes is because Western white males oppress people, and this is kind of the line of the anthropologists that seeped into the common parlance and culture. But how could you say that Christianity is diverse, or where's the social science to that, or how could you back that up?
Well, let's start at the beginning. So if you're a Christian today, then you worship a Jewish man who lived in an area we now call Palestine most of his life, and was brown-skinned, and in his ministry, broke through every racial and cultural barrier that his culture had. So we hear the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, and we think that it is mostly about caring for those in need, even if we don't know them. And it is. That's a big piece of the parable of the Good Samaritan. But when we hear Good Samaritan, even the word Samaritan makes us think good, right? We think like, oh, he's such a great Samaritan. It's like a compliment in our culture. But in Jesus' day, it was the parable of the hated ethnic and racial and religious group. He made a moral hero out of someone who his contemporaries would have frankly despised. And avoided, literally gone out of their way to avoid going near Samaritans. So Jesus did a lot of things that broke through racial and cultural barriers and gender barriers and all sorts. And then he told his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. And it's interesting, if you look at when the Spirit is poured out at the beginning of the book of Acts, and Jesus' first disciples start preaching to everyone who's there, and the people who are there are listed from places most of which are no longer called those same things now, but it's places like Egypt and Turkey, which we may not think immediately like, oh yeah, that's clearly a Christian kind of place. We then see the gospel spreading into all sorts of different kind of cultural soils. And one of my favorite moments there is in Acts chapter 8, when Philip is told to run after that chariot over there and to go and evangelize that Ethiopian guy. So there were African Christians reading the Bible centuries before the gospel came to England, and like more than 1,000 years before the gospel ever came near America. Right? So this idea that Christianity sort of somehow belongs to white Western culture doesn't line up with the New Testament. And we see in the book of Revelation this incredible vision of people from every tribe and tongue and nation worshiping Jesus together. So that, if you're a Christian, that is your destiny. But it is also in many ways becoming our reality. So today, Christianity is the most evenly distributed belief system in the world in terms of race and culture. More so than any other by a long chalk. And that's increasing. So currently, China is the global center of atheism. But the church in China is growing so fast that experts believe there'll be more Christians in China than America by 2025 or 30. And that by 2060, China could be a majority Christian country. Like, imagine what change that will bring in the world. By 2060 as well, it's expected that 40% of the world's Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, this idea that somehow the white Westerners or Europeans like me own Christianity is just unreconcilable with the facts. In America, black Americans are at least 10% more likely to identify as Christians than whites and poll higher on every mark of evangelical commitment, from church going to Bible reading to core evangelical beliefs. Hispanic Americans are also more likely to identify as Christians. And immigrants of color are planting churches across this nation. So sometimes white Americans get worried that immigration is somehow eroding America's Christian heritage. Actually, if you look at what's going on, immigration is like a blood transfusion for the American church. And I see this, where I live in Cambridge, the adjacent city, Somerville, English is the third most commonly spoken language at evangelical churches after Portuguese and Creole. So this idea, there's a sort of irony. Oh, by the way, as well, Christians have always been mostly women, or rather, most Christians have always been women, not mostly women. That's a whole different question. From the first, the Greco-Roman world, it seems, could have been as much as 2/3 male, from a combination of maternal death and childbirth and female infanticide. But the church, it seems, was as much as 2/3 female. And today as well, they're always, sorry guys, well, thank you for being here. But the reality is, Christianity has always been a majority female movement. And in fact, today, in America, the demographic most likely to be atheist is white men. So, we're lucky to have a white man on the stage who actually believes in God.
Thank you, I feel...
He's a rare breed. Take photos.
Yes. There's like 4 of us in Arkansas. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it is. It does. So you may make the statement, to put it in a sentence, that the majority of Christians, if you had to put one demographic to it, are women of color. Mm-hmm. And so really a shocking thing. And plus you consider the global South, South America, and as you said, South Africa. It's really remarkable. Yeah. Yeah, really, really incredible. All right, let me shift gears again, moving along, chapter by...
driving going on here.
Yeah, exactly, a little driving here. So I want you to riff again, okay?
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, so another perception that people have of Christianity, and maybe this has been validated by some of their experience, is not only is it anti-science, not only is it racist, but also it's misogynistic. Christianity, as you said, here's your question, doesn't Christianity denigrate women? So going back to what we said earlier, what people have a problem with probably is not the Christian faith, but their perception of it or version of it that they've heard or experienced. And a lot to talk about there. But let me. Well, actually, I want to read a quote before I do that. Could you comment on that? So you've unpacked this. You are a female.
As far as I know, yes.
You're a Christian. You're married. All these type of things. So comment on how you've engaged the topic and talking to people about it, and how would you respond to that? Does Christianity denigrate women?
Well, I wrote a whole chapter on it, so I just...
Okay. Thank you.
So here's the thing. When I was 18 or 19 in college, I properly read Ephesians chapter 5 for the first time. Now, for those of you in the know, Ephesians chapter 5 is a chapter with many beautiful things in it, including a very controversial section where the Apostle Paul says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church." Now, I read that as a 19-year-old, like a sort of academic 19-year-old who'd come from a very sort of all-women high school that was very focused on academic achievement and career achievement, etc., etc. And I was like, "Wives, submit to your husbands? You have got to be kidding me." I found it personally offensive, but you know what was worse than that? I found it really hard to hear because of how destructive it was to my witness to my friends. So I was telling my friends, like, Christianity is this radical movement that elevates the weak over the strong and the poor over the rich. And there is this beautiful foundation for racial reconciliation. And I was telling them about Jesus, who throughout his ministry continually validated women and lifted them up and held them up as examples to men, actually, quite often. Luke's Gospel has this incredible sort of side note. If you go and read Luke's Gospel and notice every time that there's a man and there's a woman, there's a man and there's a woman, man and a woman. Always the women come off better, okay? It's very interesting. But then we get to the Apostle Paul, and I'm like, oh, it's like he's sort of taken away the things that Jesus put in place. I didn't know what to do with it. And then I started reading the chapter more thoroughly and pondering on what it was actually saying. And I started noticing what the command to husbands was. And it goes like this: husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And I thought, okay, how did Christ love the church? He died on a cross for the church. He submitted to a brutal, torturous death for the church. That is how husbands are to love their wives. And I thought, how would I feel if that was the command to wives? Wives, sacrifice yourselves to the point of death for your husbands, putting their needs above your own. People sometimes say that this sort of theology of the Bible is a mandate for spousal abuse, men abusing women. Absolutely not. If it was the other way around, maybe. This idea that women should sacrifice themselves to the point of death for their husbands, but that's not what it says. And as I started to look at these two halves of what's said in Ephesians 5, I started to realize, oh, this is actually about something much bigger than me or any future imaginary, probably impossible husband, unless he's American. This is saying that the whole point of human marriage is not self-fulfillment or even production of kids. It is picturing the relationship between Jesus and his church. And as I read the Bible more thoroughly, I realized, oh, you see this thread running its way throughout the Old Testament scriptures where God is described as a faithful, loving husband and Israel, his people, as a sort of unfaithful wife. And it's like this marriage that never quite works out, and she keeps running away with other gods, and it's complete like mess. And then Jesus comes onto the stage of human history and he says, I'm the bridegroom. And John the Baptist says, I'm so happy. I'm like the bridegroom's friend now that the bridegroom's come. We're like, what's all this bridegroom talk? Well, it's because Jesus is the bride, like literally is the bridegroom. And we see the picture in Ephesians 5 of what marriage is really about. And we see it in Revelation. Angels announcing that the wedding of the Lamb has come. And Jesus is marriage to his church, bringing heaven and earth back together. So I started to realize, oh, the vision of marriage in the Bible is actually about the gospel of Jesus' love for his people and about the kind of unity that Jesus has with those who trust in him, which is a one flesh unity as we see best pictured in our human lives in marriage. And so it started to make some more sense to me. I think that the areas where I still get quite frustrated, and apologies if there are pastors in this room who I will now offend, block your ears. I find too often, who's got their ears blocked? I don't know, honestly. Too often Christians take the language of Ephesians 5 and they say, oh, women are, they come up with some theory, like, women are naturally more submissive, so that's why the Bible says, wives, submit to your husbands. Or like, men are naturally better leaders, so that's why the Bible says. Or they say, men are naturally less loving, so they're told to love. And women are naturally not submissive, so they're told. We come up with all these sort of psychological ideas about why it might say that. I didn't see any of that in the scriptures. What I see is, these are your roles in the drama of Christ and the church. It's a bit like if I was auditioning for Romeo and Juliet, and I was given the part of Juliet, I would play Juliet. It's an incredible character with some great lines, let me tell you. I wouldn't say, you know what, I actually have some better ideas about this role than Shakespeare did. And as my husband and I kind of work in the messy business of picturing Jesus' love for his church to the world. And it's a messy business. I'm not a naturally submissive person, as you may or may not have gleaned. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And here's the way you said it in the book. Ultimately, my marriage is not about me and my husband any more than Romeo and Juliet is about the actors playing the title roles. Mm-hmm. So how liberating is that? Because my function as a husband is to reflect and imitate Christ to her. And that's the theological reality that drives that. And the other thing, too, that this is somewhat frustrating, but the idea in the academy, and certainly is popular in the pews of churches, is that Jesus was wonderful, but Paul really messed everything up. He just imposed this construct on the faith that Jesus never, this revolutionary, this radical, invented. But the reality is that Ephesians 5, telling a man to give his life for his wife, is completely countercultural to first century Palestine.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, Islam wasn't teaching that.
And here's the other thing. So you hear about the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And some people say there was actually a much earlier sexual revolution, which was when Christianity started making inroads into the world. And that was when first people were saying, you know what, husbands, you are called to be faithful to your wives. Like in the Greco-Roman world, it was fine to sleep with other women. It was actually also fine to sleep with other men. There was no expectation of sexual faithfulness for husbands to wives. Like women were meant to be faithful to their husbands, for sure, but not the other way around. And one of the radical things that Christianity did was to say, okay, guys, you are covenanted to one woman, and that means that you are faithful to her. What's more than that, it means that rather than her sort of being around to just meet all your needs, you're actually there to serve her. It's extremely countercultural.
Yeah, so Paul was not a victim to his times. He was reacting against it, So let me shift gears a little bit. I saw Catherine here tonight. All these driving metaphors, right? I didn't realize I was doing this, okay? So she is a senior in high school, going off to college next year. She's going to face professors, some that are sympathetic to their faith, some that may not be, some may even be antagonistic, and some even feel compelled, and I don't want to caricaturize it, but some feel compelled to dismantle the belief system that this naive child was given to her by her poor evangelical parents. So how would you, what if it was your child, knowing where you've been, the experience you've had, the people you've been exposed to, how would you prepare your child to walk into an academic environment today in college, to move from high school to college?
I would say, one, be very intellectually curious. And don't be afraid of that.
Ask questions.
Ask questions.
Yeah.
And pursue interesting ideas. And don't feel like... I had somebody tell me recently that they had not studied... I think they said they'd wanted to study English literature at university, and they'd chosen not to because they were afraid they would lose their faith. I just found that extremely sad. Like, Jesus isn't scared of English literature.
Right.
Like this.
Right.
And in some ways, like if my faith is so fragile that I can't expose it to the best arguments that I can find, that's not necessarily a faith worth having. I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that unkindly, but I do think that we need to somewhat shift our mentality there to say, actually, if Christianity is the greatest intellectual movement in all of history, which objectively it honestly is, then we shouldn't be scared to go to college.
Yeah.
I mean, Christians literally invented the university, and places like Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge were founded in order to bring glory to God, like very explicitly so.
Yeah.
And so this idea that going to college should be an assault on our faith, I have some, qualms about. Now, having said that, it is definitely true that everybody's faith is going to be challenged in college in a whole lot of different ways. So partly because if you're moving away from home for the first time, you have new freedoms that you may not have had. And that's a time where you have to make your own decisions about things. It's an important transition. And I think we need to prepare young people for that, but not so much by sheltering them as by equipping and empowering them and saying, actually, if you can throw any question you like at Christianity, and you can study really hard, and you can actually even, not that I would recommend this, but you can see sort of sociologically that Christianity actually works really well in terms of human thriving. and many other options don't.
Yeah.
And sort of connecting back to our previous conversation about the sexual revolution, there's an irony of the sexual revolution of the 60s, which said that for centuries men have been finding ways to sneak around Christian marriage and have commitment-free sex. And like, great news, ladies, now that we have the pill, women can as well. But it turns out that actually commitment-free sex is a poison chalice. For both men and women, stable marriage is correlated with some like mental and physical health benefits.
And you're not talking now as a Christian, you're talking as a
No.
sociological studies.
This is pure sociological stuff. What sociologists do. Asking questions of people, doing surveys. And it turns out that for women in particular, increasing numbers of sexual partners is correlated with negative mental health consequences, including like, increased levels of depression and sadness and suicidal ideation and substance abuse, etc. Now, this is not to say that every woman who has multiple sexual partners is depressed and suicidal. Definitely not the case. However, in terms of human thriving, there is good data to suggest that actually Christianity's onto something with this whole idea of like, actually sex belongs in this one particular context. And I have a friend of mine who's not a Christian, who's a professor at a leading university in the States. And she says, female students routinely come to her and say, I'm having all the sex that I'm meant to be having, why am I so unhappy? And she's finding it really sad. She's like, tell me about it. And these women are having barely consensual sex a lot of the time. And they feel like it's just expected of them. And a friend of mine who lived in New York City for a long time, not a Christian again, she said in New York, men expect to sleep with you on the second date. In Boston, you might get to a third date before it's expected that you sleep with them. Like, this is junk. I mean, really, it is not leading to human thriving. And so I think in that area, we do well to give our kids some access to the data, actually.
Yeah. Well, you made this footnote here where you quote an article, sociological study, money, sex, and happiness, an empirical study. Here's the quote that the professors arrived to. Again, not a Christian study. They say this, quote, the happiness maximizing number of sexual partners in the previous year is calculated to be 1.
Yeah.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah, sociologists making an observation.
Right.
So anyway, bring it back to our point. You can send out your 17, 8-year-old into the university and say, you have a faith that can withstand all of this. And you'll meet people that are smarter than you, who are wittier perhaps than you, can frame an argument better, but that doesn't mean they're right just because they're confident and degreed and credentialed and these type of things. So they can have confidence. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think, I was sharing this with some folks earlier, my second daughter, who's now 7, when she was 3, was coming up to Christmas, we were reading the story of the Annunciation. And she said to me, Mum, I don't believe this. And I was like, okay. I said, okay, darling, do you believe that there's a God who made you? She said, yeah, I do. And I said, and do you believe that Jesus died for your sins and was raised to new life? And she said, yeah, I do. It turned out it was the angel, like the angel Gabriel, she didn't buy. So I was like, I was partly relieved because I thought, so like we've got the gospel and the angel Gabriel is like a nice to have at this point with my 3-year-old. But I thought, I'm really glad that she said to me, Mum, I don't believe this, rather than just
accepting,
saying what I wanted her to hear. And I think with our kids, if we have them, cultivating an environment where it's okay to say, I don't know about this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really confused on this question. I'm not sure I believe that, is really important. And to be a safe place for them to come and process these things. Yeah.
Well, it creates a dialogue, an atmosphere of dialogue that they'll carry on to college and then call you back and say, what about this? And continue on. And that framework holds them together when they may want to abandon their faith. But let me, so there's someone in the room perhaps who may not consider themselves a Christian. They're here tonight at the request of a friend, thinking about it, thinking around it. How would you encourage them on the journey? What would you encourage them to think about, be open to, at least buy your book, of course, that would be step 1. But beyond that, what would you, any parting thing that you would give them to think about, an approach to take to thinking through the faith, to be thoughtful about the faith?
Yeah. So many things that could be said. I would recommend reading the Gospel of Luke. Now, I have a 1-year-old and I called him Luke because I like Luke's Gospel so much. And one of the things that I find so beautiful in Luke's Gospel is that we see most clearly in Luke's Gospel how Jesus relates to people on the edges and the fringes and the margins, how he lifts up women and people who are sick and people who are left out of society for one reason or another. And I think, in my experience, many of my friends who are not Christians have a deep yearning for justice in this world and for a place for those who are marginalized and left out and undervalued and uncared for. And I think Luke's gospel in particular offers us Jesus as that place. So I would recommend reading through that. And what you might do, Crossway does this lovely series where you can, I recently got the whole set where you can have like one book volume of the Bible, text on one side and just a blank page on the other where you can write stuff. And so maybe just grabbing one of those and working through it and just thinking, what do I think of this guy? Like how does this man called Jesus come across? Because I think for many of us haven't actually read a whole gospel for ourselves in adulthood, and I think it's a really great place to start.
Just read and ask questions.
Yeah.
Good. So how did you become a believer?
I grew up in a mixed Christian family. My mum's from a Catholic family, my dad's from a sort of Church of England, Anglican family. And so when we were little, we used to alternate between a Catholic church one Sunday, Anglican church the other, back and forth. And when I was about 9, my mum was very, very sick in hospital, and I was told that she was likely to die. And at that point, I certainly, as far as I know, I believed in Jesus prior to that. But at that point, it was very clear to me that there was nothing else in this world that I could count on other than Jesus. Now, I think that is true today as well. But it was very vividly clear to me when I was 9 years old and facing the potential death of my mother, who, thank God, actually didn't die. And I think it's in those moments when we actually see clearly what we do and don't have, that we can recognize the value of what Jesus offers.
Yeah. But that without giving it away, from that point to this point to today was still a journey, an intellectual journey. You talk about same-sex attraction. You talk about your academic pursuits, the relationships that you made. And so those are in the book. People can buy and get that. But at the end of the day, God's good, isn't it, right? He doesn't give up on us. He pursues us and draws us to himself all the way through. And he himself is not afraid of our questions, so we can ask them. So how encouraging is that? Rebecca, thank you for being here tonight. This was just a lot of fun. This is a treat. Thanks for having this conversation. So I want to, if you'll stay tight, we'll do a couple more things. I want to introduce you to somebody. So Dr. Derek Brown is here. So Dr. Brown, would you come on up here? So Dr. Brown is the executive director for the Arkansas Baptist Children's Home. And so what they do, if y'all don't know, is they have roughly about 2,000 appointments where they counsel people in orphan care and adoption care and foster care. And get this is the crazy thing, they house over 300 families and children a year. That's fascinating enough, but they've been doing it for 125 years. Do I have that right? This year, 125 years. And so that represents thousands and thousands of families. And so Rebecca has signed a book for you. We thank you here. Want to recognize your ministry, put it out there in front of people. And also you want to read this book because there's a check in here for the proceeds for all tonight. So all the ticket sales from y'all are all going to Arkansas Baptist Children's Home. Thanks for being here, friend. Very, very grateful. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. It's so fun as we're here talking about things in the city and having the city conversation to support the work of those that are doing it right now. There are people at the children's home serving children. So Rebecca, again, thank you for being here. I'm going to let you escape for a minute to go sign books. Stay here for just a second. I want to share with you one more thing about our upcoming books. But thank you for being here, and we'll get her out to the book room to sign those books, and she'll be out there as agreed to do so. We have her books available for purchase. They're $25 as the cover price, but we're selling tonight for $20, and you can have her go back and sign the book and be a part of it. Hey, we do something different tonight that we haven't done before. There's a card there in your seat. If you would grab this, and it's actually, maybe you'll tell, but it's perforated. If you don't mind, everybody just do this. They come across pretty easy. If you could tear those out. And here's why. We've got some upcoming events that are exciting. I want to tell you about two of them tonight. If you're on our mailing list, you know that you get updates and availability of tickets before that. And so just indicate if you would like to stay up to date with other preferred events. And also, we would like to contact you. There may be some who would say, you know what, I want to dialogue about this some more. I want to have another conversation about that. So just indicate that on there. Just check that you'd like to have a further conversation about this. Leave that in your seat. We'll collect those others and we'll reach out to you by way of email and give you more information about how you can further a conversation about Christianity that we've been talking about tonight. Now here's our next two events. Coming up in December, we're having Vishal Manglawati. I've been working on that all month, really, getting that right. So Christianity Today called Manglawati the leading intellectual in India for Christians. Phenomenal story about how he's been actually going against the caste system in India as a sociologist who's also a Christian and a philosopher for many, many years. But in 2011, he wrote a book called The Book That Changed Your World, and how the Bible actually shaped, coming from someone who is a non-Westerner, really the structure of the world. And he's going to be here in Arkansas in December. Fascinating conversation. And so what we've done is we've gone ahead and released tickets tonight. We normally don't do that. We send an email out later on. So if you're interested in that event, go ahead and get those. And then also, we've announced this somewhat in the city. There's a Baptist preacher who's been leaking the word, even though it's supposed to. But on February the 28th, Ravi Zacharias is going to be here. And so we're just very, very excited about that conversation for this City Center conversation. Of course, gifted intellectual and one of the most well-known apologists for the Christian faith. So again, if you believe all that we're talking about tonight, or you don't and just curious, a great time to come and have those conversations. So this is what we haven't done before, but we're going to go ahead and release those tickets starting now. So we have people I know already from Texas and some from Tennessee, some from Oklahoma said, we're coming to the Zacharias event. The tickets are going to go probably pretty fast. And so we will have limited seating. We'll be in a bigger venue than this one, but go ahead and get those tickets now. You can go ahead and do those. You can buy those online at citycenterconversations.com. All the information is right there. Once again, thanks for being here tonight. Very, very grateful. Have a good evening.